Then, greetings. My name is Benjamin Talton. I'm an associate professor of history at Temple University, and I'm also a member of the advisory board for the Center for the Study of Africa and the African Diaspora at NYU, which is hosting this event this afternoon or this evening, depending upon where you are. I want to acknowledge in particular and send greetings to Dr. Michael Gomez, who's a Silver Professor of History at NYU and also the director of CSAD, Center for the Study of Africa and African Diaspora, and also Sharice Taylor, who is behind the scenes making all this happen, who is the administrator for the center. I'm so excited about this conversation today, not only as a way to pull myself away from the vagaries of the emerging Biden administration and seeing what's going on with Bobby Wine, who's under house arrest and not actually under house arrest, depending upon what the Ugandan government likes to say right now, but also because this issue that we want to dive into of African art and artifacts housed in Western institutions and this idea of rethinking museums in the African context in particular, but also in the Western sense of museums and museum culture. But it intersects with so many different issues of politics and culture, language in Africa and around the world. So it's highly political, it's diplomatic, and there's kind of an underlying theme of violence, right? And we get into this debate about decolonization as well. So I'm very excited to have this conversation this afternoon, this evening. Now, and one of the questions I want to get into is just this, it seems like there's this reinvigoration of this conversation around rethinking museums and restitution of African art and artifacts. And I'm aware that this is a conversation that goes back sometime, even we could even say into the 19th century on restoring looted items, cultural relics, and religious artifacts from the continent. But it seems to me that there, in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been this resurgence. And this is one thing, you could correct me if I'm wrong, the panelists that I'm about to introduce, but it seems that one of the things that's driving this resurgence, one is Macron's visit to Ouagadougou in 2017. I have to get into the right century, 2017, where he gives this speech where he says that President Macron said he's of a different generation than previous presidents. He didn't come of age in the colonial period, so he doesn't see himself as superior to the citizens of the former colonial territories. And he also makes this statement about heritage, where he says in 2017, African heritage can't just be European private collections and museums. And he organizes this commission that I hope we could discuss as well, that leads to the Savoy SAR report, and it's titled The Restitution of African Cultural Heritage Toward a New Relational Ethics. I think this is explosive in some ways, coming from Macron, because he uses the term, or the report uses the term, the report that he sanctions, uses the term restitution, which has an important meaning for the legacy of European looting, plundering on the African continent and its relation to our current moment. So I also want to get into this point of language, but as I situate Macron, I don't in any way want to marginalize or erase the history of the activism of scholars and artists and activists who've tirelessly pushed this debate forward for generations. And I'm thinking in particular about a great admirer of the work of the Addis-based Afromet and the artist, scholar, activist Chike Okeke-Ogulu, who's raised the alarm about auctions at Christie's and Sotheby's, particularly around Igbo artifacts taken during the Biafra War in the late 1960s. And he describes these are artworks that you're auctioning, so artifacts that you're auctioning that are covered in the blood of the Nigerian people. But also groups like the Benin Dialogue Group is bringing together an international coalition of museums and artists and activists to rethink what do we do with these Benin bronzes in the British Museum and how we can get them back to Nigeria, and envisioning, again, this new way of thinking about museums. But I hope we could situate all of this in this current moment and work our way backwards, work our way forward, talk about language, talk about legacy. And toward that end, to shape this conversation, I'm very pleased to be joined by a very distinguished panel of scholar, activists, and artists. Uh, Start things off with Delinda J Collier, who corrected me that her last name is British, not French. I wanted to say Collier. She's Associate Professor of Art History, Theory, and Criticism at the Art Institute of Chicago, and she's currently the Interim Dean of Graduate Studies. I have two books that she's the author of. One is Repainting the Walls of Lunda, Information, Colonialism, and Angolan Art, published in 2016. And a forthcoming work, Media Primitivism, Technological Art in Africa. Is it still forthcoming? I haven't.
No, it's out.
It's out. Okay, congratulations.
Yeah.
By Duke,
Thanks.
Coming out of Duke University Press. I also have Rashida Bumbray, who is currently an artist in residence at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Her permanent day job is Director of Culture and Art for the Open Society Foundations. Ms. Bumbray is also an accomplished choreographer whose practice draws from traditional African-American vernacular art forms and folkways. Her performances have been presented by the Tate Museum, the New Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Harlem Stage, Project Row Houses, and Summer Stage. And she has very impressively been nominated for the prestigious Bessie Award for Outstanding Emerging Choreography and the Independent Curators International Curatorial Vision Award. So welcome, Ms. Bumbray.
Thank you so much.
Last but certainly not least, Siraj Rasul, who I have been following on Twitter for some time, so I'm pleased to see him face to face here. He is a professor of history at the University of the Western Cape and directs its African program in Museum and Heritage Studies. He's been on the board of numerous museums in South Africa that I've had the opportunity to visit. District 6 Museum, Ezekiel Museums of South Africa, the South African Heritage Research Agency, and the National Heritage Council of South Africa. He is currently the principal investigator for Action for Restitution to Africa. He has previously chaired the scientific committee of the International Council of African Museums and currently serves on the high-level Museums Advisory Committee of UNESCO. He has published widely in journals, and he is the author of one book in particular, The Politics of Heritage in Africa, Economies, Histories, and Infrastructure, out of Cambridge University Press in 2015. Welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us in this conversation. What we'll do, so much. Absolutely, what we want to do is, let's just set things off. And I posed this initial question that we don't have to stick with around what brought us to this current moment in the conversation. The caveat, of course, is that this conversation has been going on for over a century now, at least. But I'm suggesting that there has been this resurgence. And I think the conversation around the bending bronzes at the British Museum, the David Ajayi designed, planned museum in Edo in Nigeria is part of this resurgence. But beyond that, I want you to just take a few minutes and present your own positionality and your thoughts around this issue. Just take about 5 minutes or so. We won't stick strictly to the time. Present your ideas, and then we could come back and regroup in this conversation. In the meantime, for those who've dialed in, we have this chat function that I'm going to do my best to keep my eye on as I listen to the presenters, and I'm going to keep my eye on the chat. So at about the 35, 40-minute mark or so, I'll turn to the chat and bring some of those issues and questions up and present to our panelists. So if you don't mind, if we can begin with Professor Collier. Let's take a few minutes and present some thoughts and ideas and perhaps some questions, and followed by Ms. Bumbray, and we'll round things out with Siraj Rasul.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation, and I'm really excited to be on a panel with three people who I admire a lot. I think I think my research does a roundabout to repatriation and restitution. For a long time, I worked on Angola and the questions of cultural heritage there were part of a chapter that I wrote about the 1970s post-independence movement there, and the change to a Marxist-Leninist orientation for museums, and the sort of radical reimagining that was happening there in 1976 until about 1980, where, you know, museum heritage was seen to need to be retooled to the people, and in ways that were practical and philosophical. You know, they talked a lot about moving collections out to rural areas and having the people curate different shows. There was a lot of talk of Marxist kind of pan-culturalism, and so trying to heal divisions that had been caused by colonial divide and conquer techniques. And so this was a long question in Angola. I had written about a museum in a remote area of northeastern Angola that was started by a diamond mining company, of all things. And so the process that museum went through to both when it was established and then what happens to it after independence. So there were a lot of questions that I was asking in the first book, and I think that sort of naturally took me to this second book that's just come out about what exactly are these objects we're talking about. And so in the introduction to this new book, Media Primitivism, I do sort of a deep dive into what we mean, or what these objects mean, how they mediate different things, both in a very literal, objective and material kind of way, but also what work are they doing, you know, throughout their lives. And so I think, you know, one of my aims there was to historicize this notion of the fetish, which I think plays a huge part in what we do when we talk about repatriation. The way the objects themselves were characterized as evidence for a growing scientific discourse that naturalized whiteness. And so I think, you know, moving forward, my research, where I want the research to go, is this very question of artistic and scientific discourse and field work, evidence, and with a particular kind of focus on denaturalizing whiteness. So, you know, if you had to ask me what's different about this moment, is people are finally starting to talk about that, about you know, whiteness and how it plays a part in this whole history. And then, you know, the kind of more interconnectedness that we all share with mediums such as this, Zoom and different other things. And then also, I think there's this really interesting growing collaboration between scholars in the field of African studies and scholars in African American studies, and critical race theory really penetrating African studies in a way that hadn't been done before because of that naturalized whiteness in African studies, right? And in a way, sort of backwardness, or it's a long delay in acknowledging that history of whiteness there.
Thank you for that. Before we push on, if you don't mind, I just want to take a second because you use these two terms, denaturalizing whiteness and then naturalizing whiteness. Perhaps if we reverse the order and talk about what naturalized whiteness means and what is denaturalizing whiteness as a process, if you don't mind. Right.
It's, you know, it was a series. I think you can look at a series of moves that were made, you know, race theory, early race theory, eugenics, things like that, you know, kind of assumed or it proposed that white Europeans were the standard, right? And that everything else that deviated from that was the deviation. So that was one move. But then what happens is that collection of moments and studies and things that, and I'm talking way back into the 16th century, this starts, you know? So it takes us going, you know, that far back to start picking apart. And so over centuries, this is built, you know, this is a long time that scientific discourse is building around this idea of a generic white European standard, right? And everything else is a deviance. And so you can even look at instruments of science, lenses, microscopes, objects, medical objects, things like that. standardizing bodies, and serving to concretize ideas of whiteness, or of a normalcy, right? So yeah, I think there is a lot more that we could say about that, but specifically in my field, I'm really interested in this term field work and the idea of a field, and that a field is somewhere you go to. It's not where you live, right? But you go elsewhere to do the field work. You observe in kind of this neutral way, and then you collect that stuff and come back, right? You return, you set something up, you then present it to an audience. So this idea of field work is something that I'm pretty obsessed with right now, of picking apart the assumptions and the objects that were created to do that work.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating because you think about field work from anthropologists, you're going to these sites to investigate culture and performance, but then it's legitimate if you leave to go to these places. That's authentic research. But then
Right.
museums are authentic when the artifacts and items are brought to Europe, where they have a stage in which they can be engaged with, and then they have meaning. So there's this
Right.
irony there, or this kind of contradiction.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, people are talking about museums as acting as gatekeepers to, the here and there, right? The here and the elsewhere, the field and the, so there's a lot of kind of objects and institutions that are built around this idea.
Mm-hmm. That's wonderful. So many things that we could return back to in a few minutes when we circle back around. I want to turn to Rashida Bumbray. I have some slides for you. Let's see if we can work this out. Let me know if you see what's here, and you could walk me through this. Do we have success here?
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Yes, and maybe you can start there. That's fine. First of all, I just want to say how honored I am to be here and in conversation with the three of you about this, and just say that in my role at the Open Society Foundations as a director of culture and art, I collaborate in very deep ways with my colleagues in other parts of the foundations. And the Open Society Foundations is the largest global funder of human rights and democracy work in the world. And so a lot of our work has to do with the rule of law and justice and rights, et cetera. And so the reason why the Open Society Foundations decided to get involved with the restitution movement was really following the report, the Savoy report that you mentioned, Benjamin, and really wanting to support this momentum through grant making, advocacy, and really thinking about how we could support this argument around restitution and the healing of colonial wounds, the confronting of colonial histories through both a moral kind of directive and also, of course, cultural directive, as well as the sort of legal perspective. And so we've tried to think about how we could consider how to support this work from all of these myriad perspectives. And specifically, really from the positionality of looking at the agency and authorship of African actors on the continent and in the diaspora. And, I think I come to this from the specific role as a director of culture and art, really thinking about what is the sort of cultural role that we need to be considering, especially around this kind of cultural and knowledge production from the continent. And really, how do artists and cultural producers play a really important role in this dialogue and in keeping up the momentum for what I see as this movement, which I think is part of the larger global racial justice movement that has been building. And I think I'm glad to hear, Delinda, that you spoke about really, the history of all of these kinds of studies, whether museology, anthropology, but I do think in all of those, there has always been a number of people who've thought about what are the kind of ethical and moral directives that I'm using in my work. If we think about, people in ethnography like Catherine Dunham or Zora Neale Hurston, for example. And so I also think that, you know, there are really important artists and activists that are leading, I think, a lot of the intellectual space, but also the cultural space around this. So I wanted to show this image of myself only because, as you said, Benjamin, you know, I come to this this moment in history and this work really from the lens of both being in philanthropy, but also as an artist and an activist. And this is an image from a performance in 2019 in the Gallery 305, which is where most of the African art is displayed in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And this was a performance called Braiding and Singing a Point, where I really wanted to consider what it meant to have an emotional and a spiritual kind of restitution. What did it mean for these objects to be metaphors for the New World African experience when, you know, the person or the object is removed from its cultural context? How do we sort of re-engage through cultural forms? And so we did a performance where we sang to all of the objects in the gallery and thought about, you know, what are the kind of spiritual aspects of these objects that have been so divorced for so many years from their reality, and how can we sort of try to bridge that gap? Also being myself African American, and not necessarily having those specific cultural you know, language to speak to these objects, but how do we try to bridge that gap? And so I just wanted to start with that around my perspective. And if you could go to the slide of Faustin, which is number 3. And I also just wanted to talk about some of the artists that we support, not only through the restitution work, but also through something called a Soros Arts Fellowship. Faustin Lenyakula is a choreographer based in the DRC in Kisangani. And he was invited to do a performance at the Metropolitan Museum of Art when the Congo exhibition was on view in 2017. And he walked through the galleries and he asked to go into the storage, and he saw this object, which you see on the platform here. And on seeing that object, he asked to spend more time with it. And the curator said, well, you know, this one isn't in the show because it's less significant for this reason and that reason. And he said, well, this is actually quite significant to me because it's from the town where my mother is from. And there are no more of this object in that town. And so he went back to the DRC, to this town where he hadn't been since he was a young boy. And he actually found someone who still knew how to make this object. And he asked him to make the object so that he could bring it back and actually touch it and do different things in the performance. But after they made the object, they actually consecrated it and gave it its spiritual value. And he decided that he refused to take it away because he said, so many of the things that we have that are of value are removed. And so I actually want to leave it here. And so I wanted to just bring his work up really in thinking about how restitution is a metaphor for what is lost, right? And so what can be gained or what can be recentered in terms of the objects that actually go with the cultural knowledge production that you know, has been divorced from its own context. And so I'll stop there, and I have other slides, but I'll bring them in once we have the conversation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. There are definitely some important questions that you've raised that I want to circle back to. And you put that so nicely, what has been lost and what has been gained. I guess that's a sub-theme for our conversation. So thank you again. I'll turn to Siraj Rasul for just a few minutes for your thoughts, and then we could open things up. I also want to encourage those who have dialed in to put your thoughts and questions in the chat, and I'll do my best to get to those as the conversation progresses. Rasul?
Thank you so much, Benjamin. I'm a historian at the University of the Western Cape, historically Black university in South Africa. Obviously, I was made and became an adult in an apartheid state. Went to university in a racial system, etc. And in my department, which was a radical anti-apartheid university, we developed an approach to historical studies that we call public history, but which is not like public history in the United States, where professional historians hold on to the authority and they do translation of stories of the past to members of the public. This is a concept of history in the public that repositions authority in public spaces. And a few years ago, two colleagues and I wrote a book about this called Unsettled History, about these kinds of questions, about South Africa's multiple colonialisms that make it have a mercantile colonialism of the Dutch East India Company, British colonialism that places it much like other ex-British African colonies, but also an internal colonialism of a white state that became independent in 1910 and that became an apartheid state in the late 1940s. And so and of course then also having formal colonial authority over Namibia. So South Africa is very interesting around those questions, although it is not exceptional. In this work that I've been doing, I was extremely fortunate. I come from District 6, which is an inner city neighborhood in Cape Town that experienced forced removals. I was able to work with an excellent group of activists and scholars to create and to really make the District 6 Museum, which is not just a museum about a story of a removal of a certain kind of urban history of race and resistance, but was an experimental space for a new museology, or a new concept of museum outside of the museum that governs objects. But this was a processual museum, a museum of transactions of knowledge, of interrogation, of all manner of questions in society. In this laboratory of making a democratic order, I also, with my colleagues, worked on what it means to transform old museums, because the museums in South Africa and their collections were divided much like they are in museums in Europe and the United States, where they are divided between, the collections are divided between people with history or cultural history and people without history. So as you'll know from the Museum of Natural History in the Smithsonian system, if you want to go to Africa, you go to the Natural History Museum. It's pretty much like that here, and where obviously that kind of division was untenable. And in the process at Iziko Museums of South Africa, that museum undertook one of the most ambitious epistemic projects in the history of museum making in the world, of abolishing that distinction. In my research with my colleague Martin Lagassic on the history of collecting, it was very interesting to discover that actually the formation of that museum, its transformation as a modern museum in the early 20th century as the South African Museum, was founded on illegally disinterred human remains at a time when South Africa was becoming a nation and where South African scientists competed with European scientists for access to the dead human body of Khoisan people. That was like foundation to the modern museum and to our systems of race, racial science, and to, in the making of a museum that administered people as members of races and as members of tribes. And in the process, my colleague Martin Lagassic and I researched the collecting activities of an Austrian anthropologist by the name of Rudolf Perch, whose assistants disinterred human remains and who collected all manner of material culture, field sound recordings, and so forth. And this is a collecting legacy that is spread across many museums in Vienna. And we, of course, discovered the records of a police inquiry into this because of the illegality of the human remains collecting. And this, of course, led to restitution of the skeletons of Klaas and Troy Pinar, in which we were able to theorize what a restitution is. How do you do a restitution, and what does restitution do? How do you go about this? And one of the arguments that we made is that you cannot divorce the human remains from the material culture, because they were collected together. They were trafficked and transported on the same ox wagons, on the same ships, and entered the system together. Rudolf Perch was appointed the very first professor of anthropology and ethnology at the University of Vienna. And so that experience of doing a restitution, from the moment of discovery of the records in the archive to working with government, being on the advisory, on the restitution advisory committee, being in the negotiations and working out what it is to do a restitution and how you go about effecting the possibility of a rehumanization. So from that experience, I have gotten to do work, quite a lot of work in Germany, in Berlin, advising them on the restitution of their human remains collection. And you know that there are restitutions that happen to Namibia. There is a restitution that is underway and that has been interrupted by COVID, involving 1,000 skulls collected mainly by a scholar by the name of Chekanovsky to Rwanda. And you can imagine the power of the skulls of racial science meeting the human remains of the genocide in that society, what it will mean for Rwanda. So this is work that is very important work that is ongoing, and the distinction that becoming increasingly clear, that the distinction that we make between human remains and material culture is a false distinction. We have such a humanist concept of material culture and of the collection of art that I'm afraid is becoming more and more apparent that is not the case. We know this from the research in the Savoir report, scholarship by David Anderson, importantly in the recent book, The Brutish Museums by my colleague Dan Hicks, with whom I work in the restitution project. It's very clear that museums are not beneficiaries of colonial violence. Museums were embedded in the colonial violence itself. Museums emerged as an institution marked by the violence of conquest. And so all of the work that has gone into defending collections that have been acquired through violence, when we are in a world at a time when we are needing to recommit ourselves to a democratization of the societies in the world, where we know that the decolonization that happened of African societies in the 1950s and the 1960s resulted in an incomplete sovereignty. And we are attending to those kinds of questions now, even though we also say that a restitution model that occurs through state-to-state negotiations and that imagines a return to a monumental museum in a receiving society is only one kind of model. You're talking about rethinking the relationship between artworks, artifacts, human remains, and society. And that we need to think about new models of museum. And here the work that museums like the District 6 Museum, many museums in Latin America, like Museu da Maré in Rio de Janeiro, these offer us models for rethinking what we mean by museum.
Thank you so much for that. I want to stick with you just for a second, because you brought up so much and my paper is full of notes based on what you said. But just getting down to the basics, there are certain implications from disaggregating material culture and art from human remains, and you get into that. But in this issue of human remains, then, what does restitution mean? Because we've been using the word restitution, but what does it mean? What does it look like? You're calling for a new model, maybe District 6 puts us in the right direction. Delinda spoke about the Marxist-Leninist restoration projects of Angola in 1976 to 1980. But what is restitution in a very basic way? What does it look like in terms of a definition, in terms of a process, in terms of an outcome in this, particularly in the South African context?
You know, we are going through very important discussions right now. And the work that has happened over the last few years is now placing us increasingly in a position where we need to theorize what this means. Certainly we know, and not wanting to specifically argue from a South African perspective, we've had the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Mm-hmm. So one of the things we know is that you have to put the human remains of colonial racism alongside the human remains of apartheid's violence. And we do that, I do that with my colleagues in a wonderful project that they do on forensic history, mm-hmm. which works with the idea of forensic not just as empirical detail, but forensic as inquiry and conversation and constituting a forum. And so that is something we know. We know that we need to think all of these R words alongside each other: reparations, mm-hmm. repair, restoration. I know that moving from the African continent to North America, I know that these terms restitution and repatriation mean different things. And there are specific histories of how these concepts are deployed. Certainly, in South Africa, we use restitution to mean the restoration of your rights to land mm-hmm. from which you were removed, and where you have a number of possibilities for relief, including actual return to the land and landscape from which you were removed. In which land doesn't have to be thought of as property, but land mm-hmm. is filled and marked with meaning. Mm-hmm. And so certainly we know that restitution has legal aspects. It has aspects that pertain to property. But when you read the most important aspects of the Savoy report, and you listen to the conversations that are happening, that are multilateral, including one that was hosted by Tufts University at the end of last year, and in the arguments presented by my other colleague in the restitution project, Nana Oforiata Ayim, mm-hmm. that restitution enables a new relationship with community. Mm-hmm. It enables a social healing. It enables a reconnection. And the most important element that we need to incorporate into that discussion is how do you alter the relationship between the artifact and people? Because museums, conventionally, the modern museum, the museums that hold these collections were founded to regulate the relationship between people and artifacts. These were museums that were about the governance of things and the governance of people, to turn people into citizens and subjects. And we need to fundamentally rethink citizenship. What does it mean to be a citizen? And we need precisely a participatory and enunciatory concept of citizenship in which the museum is not a collection. The museum is not an exhibition space, but the museum is a means of not, I don't like the term sharing authority because that also holds on to authority, but reorganizing authority. And so museums are just so amazing spaces. They are the most important public spaces in the society. That is why they are so important. They have become so important. That is why they are the fulcrum of a number of social struggles at the moment. And so we've got to, this is something that we've got to work on. Restitution is not an event. It's not something to be planned that will have a return date and then it will be completed. Our Namibian colleagues have been hamstrung by that kind of events management, understanding of these things. This is something that's going to be with us for decades, even up to a century. This is, and of course, it is a new opportunity for institution building, for capacity development that has been denied to African societies because the international system of ICOM and UNESCO and so have not served African societies well. They've reproduced the colonial model in which theory is deemed to be something that happens in Europe and Africans are deemed to be carers. You know, you get to reproduce that model and then you reproduce the model of the European monumental museum and you don't allow for other possibilities. So there's so much work that we have to do here. And at this stage, we need to be enhancing the possibilities for African claims making. That's not just, that recognizes the role of the state, that this involves international relations, that recognizes an important role for the African Union and for the different regional bodies that are so unaccustomed to questions of culture. More accustomed as they are to political economy, but this is an exciting time for all of us. Yeah. We are grateful to to the Open Society Foundations. We are grateful to our colleagues, the curators in Europe, who fight against their principles. We are grateful to the activists in Europe as well, but we cannot make restitution a program of European gift making.
No, thank you for that. And it is an exciting time and it's an opportunity. But what you're saying reminds us that museums are not just about the past. It's about the present. And I'm concerned, perhaps displaced concerned, that there might be a reproducing of the European model as we move forward with these museums. I'm concerned about this language of cooperation and sharing, of loaning items and artifacts to African institutions, the sense that they may be, and then they go back. So so many important issues raised there, and I think you use the term museums as rooted in the history of violence, and I think of Jorge Wildeus, who has a nice piece in Africa as a country. Just yesterday, the day before, he speaks about epistemic violence, and that's with us today, particularly around the Ge'ez manuscripts from Magdala from 1867, where now Ethiopian students studying Ge'ez manuscripts are deprived of that connection with that lineage, with their ancestors. So this is a violence upon knowledge production, is what that's with them to this day, and the legacy of the violence that the British executed in 1867. Because of that, these churches, which are museums in themselves, close their doors and guard their manuscripts more jealously. And these students don't have access to the knowledge. And in British Museum, they'll say, well, these manuscripts are as important as any manuscripts we have, even more important than the manuscripts we have from India. And so these have become relics, but they're not there. It's what he says. What does he say? He says it's like burying live bodies in graveyards, keeping these manuscripts in this way. So this epistemic violence, but brings us back to this issue of social justice that Rashida Bumbray raised, again, around this issue of restitution. You said tied to the global social justice movement. And again, as I started at the outset, thinking of this moment and the meaning, as Professor Rasool says, it has a great deal of opportunity, reasons to be optimistic. Can you speak to that a little bit more? The ways in which you see this is tied to issues of social justice. We heard very eloquently issues related to land and in Namibia and in South Africa. Can you speak to that just a little bit, globally, and just even some specifics that you want to tie in there?
Sure, thank you. And thank you so much for that. Siraj was super rich. And it made me think a lot about, the indigenous struggle for human remains and cultural objects, which has been connected to land in the, in the North American context, as well as in Australia, New Zealand. And we've tried to make some connections there as well through our work. But really, when I was speaking about this global racial justice movement, I think we all witnessed the events of this summer and the way that the murder of George Floyd, the lynching of George Floyd, activated, I think, young people around the world. And I think, it's intergenerational movement, but we saw young people take to the streets. And I think, this is the largest racial justice movement in history. And so, at one moment. And so what we started to notice, especially, as we had been investing and beginning this process supporting restitution, which I love you saying it's a process. And my colleague, Anthony Richter, who works with me on this, always says that as well. Restitution is not an event. But what we noticed with the events of this summer were people actually making a very deep connection between the existence of monuments to, people who were horrendous murderers through colonial violence, through racial violence, and actually bringing those monuments down. And cities actually brought those monuments down, and this was happening all over the world. And so we saw a very deep connection between this Black Lives Matter movement and the conversation about restitution, reparations, repatriation. And, I wanted to bring up the activist Wazulu Diabanza, who, was charged and later acquitted by the French court for removing a spear from the Museum of African, Oceanic, and Amerindian Arts. And I think that level of activism happening in the museum, I think, there's a long lineage, which we've talked about here today, but I think there is a very intense movement that is connecting the objects that we see in the public space. And like you said, Siraj, the museum is an important public space. So in the physical public space of the public square, but in our museums, how did these monuments to men who have, raped and pillaged and looted and, done all of these horrible things, how are they standing representations of the very systems that need to be dismantled? And so I think that connection is made really, I think, in popular culture right now. And I think it's a really important movement. And, I wanted to also respond when you mentioned the work of Nana Alfreada Ayin, because she's also one of the fellows within the Open Society Foundations and the fellowship that I run, the Soros Arts Fellowship. And she actually has now been a part of leading a president's committee in Ghana on museums and monuments. It's a 13-person committee. And I had an image of them, which you can show. And really the purpose is to advise the government on a radical new direction for museums and cultural heritage sites. You'll see a group of them standing there. And so I think, just to your question about how do we not recreate the model of museums that have been, as you said, a form of violence themselves, aspects of, a part of the process of colonialism and violence. And so I think having leaders like this that are able to really reimagine what the function of the museum, as you said, Siraj, and really, think about what it means to work in community. We have another wonderful grantee, the African Artists Foundation, and they have Lagos Photo Fest. And this past year for Lagos Photo Fest, they did something called a home museum. And it really was around this idea of rapid restitution. What does it mean for us to look at the things that we live with, that are our own cultural objects that have significance to us, and imagine, and sort of elevate that function and have conversations in community about that. And I think, people are doing a lot of work imagining what will it mean when these objects are back in their spaces of origin. So I'll stop there.
I'm muted. Did you want to speak a little bit more about the project in Accra and some of the work that group is doing?
Well, I'll just say that, as Siraj mentioned, Nana has been doing a lot of important work around sort of deconstructing some of the forms that in museology and ethnography and anthropology. So she actually is creating an alternative encyclopedia that she calls an African cultural encyclopedia, but really looking at what are alternative forms of knowledge. You know, how can oral history, how can, you know, the work that you do with herbs, healing, how can those things also exist within an encyclopedia? And so she's also done a lot of alternative museum work, taking containers around to different parts of the 10 regions in Ghana. And so she's really an important leader. And this is a very new development, this group, really that will help them to envision the kind of museums and public kind of memorials that need to exist in Accra and throughout Ghana.
No, it's fantastic. That's some exciting work being done by artists and activists on the continent. I think of my good friend Ida Malune in Addis, who started Addis Photo Fest years ago. So there's wonderful work being done on the continent, throughout the continent. I want to shift gears just a little bit and turn back to Delinda. And I want to highlight put some of your own writing on the spot, because I read your wonderful article again, and Sean Jacobs is my friend. I'm not shouting out Africa as a country only because he's my friend, maybe a little bit, but they do fantastic work. I'm just going to read a little bit of what you wrote on Sindike Dokolo, who for many of us in the West is most known for being married into the Dos Santos family and being a billionaire. And some of the, there's some little kind of a controversial figure. And so you write, if you don't mind, I'll just read a little bit, and then you could provide some background and then discuss some of your thinking about it. I'm trying to share my screen sometimes. Let's see if this works. All right, there we go. Are we seeing this? Okay, so you wrote, and this is from January 23rd last year, so almost exactly a year ago. So I'll just read these two paragraphs here caught my eye. Most of his art world colleagues find Dokolo sincere in his love of art. They seem willing to separate his profile as a collector and now curator from any allegations of financial wrongdoing with his spouse. Anna Alex Kofi, a French Ivorian magazine publisher and curator, told Le Monde, "Do you know many people who would buy works for hundreds of thousands of euros to return them to their country? He is a defender of African art, and as such, I am by his side." Further, they tend to believe Dokolo's now undermined claim that his money and interests are separate from Isabel's. Here's the problem. Of course, we fully support the restitution of African art, the expansion of art scenes on the continent, and rethinking museums, but we question whether the economic system that makes Dokolo's work possible comports with the social benefit of art repatriation. If African art becomes an empty symbol of decolonization, it risks becoming a fetish once more. I apologize. For some reason, I was reading that without my glasses, so it was a bit of a struggle. I should have put them on. But Delinda, could you explain who he was, a bit of his involvement in the finance and art world, and then you point to his engagement in this space as problematic?
Yeah, and I just want to mark the fact that he tragically passed in October, and it was a huge loss for the field and for a lot of artists who we worked with. So that's, and writing this, it was, I didn't want this to just drop without a context, and that's always a problem when you write, anything, but particularly when it goes online quickly. Because I really think his work requires a context. Not only that he was this huge hero of contemporary African art, funded so many artists, really worked hard to increase the visibility of contemporary art in the world, but particularly on the continent, which a lot of people just forget to do. And he was pretty tireless about doing that, and also searching and researching and finding and recollecting classical African art. So all of that bracketed with that context, also the context, right, that I already explained of the Marxist-Leninist history in Angola, and his sort of profile as a hyper-capitalist, as being, kind of going against that history of Marxist-Leninism in the country. So, and I wrote a little bit about him in that first book, pointing out some of the debates that were occurring in the early 2000s around this history, and who should sponsor art, who should see it, who should own it, right? So what we kind of, I think the big issue that I take away from Dakolo and what he was doing and his bringing classical African art back to Angola, but also into his collection, right? And there was always a real question about where those pieces were going. Were they going into his collection, or were they going, to the state? He would claim that there was a partnership happening, but it was a little bit unclear what was actually happening. So he was, using the two models that we've identified, which is the state repatriation model and the private collection repatriation model, which in my opinion is not a repatriation model. And it's highly problematic because we know private collections are really undermining public institutions of art, and increasingly around the world. So for me, what I landed on with Dakolo and the problems that I identified there is exactly what Siraj was talking about, which is public and private property. And I really think that we have to get to a point where we look at the laws and what law does in terms of protecting private property versus if we flip that equation of what law does, it should ask us, or we should ask what the law is compelling us to do and what obligations we have to one another, right? And use the law to ask those questions instead of using the law to protect private property. And in South Africa, you see this exact history of private property, copyright, intellectual law, and those types of things being instated exactly when the land ordinances were being implemented. So they, like Siraj was saying, they go hand in hand. And so I would like for us to use the opportunity of repatriation restitution to ask the moral questions that Rashida brought this up to, the moral question of what the law is asking us to do for one another instead of what it's doing to protect our private property.
Thanks. As we pay attention to time, the Q&A function is still open. Feel free to jump in if you are dialed in with any questions or comments. I'm going to turn to one right now. I know we're at the hour, so I want to make sure we get as many voices in as possible. One question is from Yannick Etundi, who says, I'm a PhD student at Brown University in the history of art. And I'm doing the same thing again, trying to read. I'm trying to read out my glasses. Those days are over, and I have to read with these glasses now. It says, my question is the following: how can we deconstruct from a racial point of view counter arguments against repatriation in a country like France, which rejects the concept of race and has not fully come to terms with its colonial past? Many counter arguments advanced by France are rooted in white supremacy and neocolonialism, specifically in regards to the patronizing idea that Africans are not capable of preserving their own heritages. Delinda, you just alluded to a similar point there related. Anyone, feel free to respond to Atundi's point there.
I'll just jump in quickly to say that, the 19th century, when those laws to sort of mediate the concerns of looting and whether looting was moral or not, specifically left out so-called uncivilized countries, right? To say that a just war meant that you could take booty or, money only applied to who, so-called civilized nations. And so, and it was based on race. So that's, one aspect.
Yeah, we need to be attentive to what is happening in the relationship of France with its former colonies. There's an extent to which the Savoir report speaks mainly to the history of Francophone, the Francophone African experience, and particularly the Francophone West African experience. And France is going through some processes at the moment with this refiguring its very problematic and unresolved relationship with Algeria, which is quite fundamental. And, you know, of course, French law has this terrible problem of inalienability, and that these steps and the political decisions made to restitute limited numbers, those 20 to Benin, that whip, that object to Mali, and so forth. This is happening in an incredibly legalistic fashion, but we are becoming so aware of just how museums have, in a sense, art washed. There is a long history of art washing, to use Delinda and Marissa's term here, that and where even the policies and the laws that we have start in 1970, they don't take into account this prior history. They call that, they want to do a clean slate on that history. And the extent of this violence is palpable. And it's also, we are learning what happened to the colonial archive that just got looted and taken to Europe. And so this is a widespread problem, and we are only at the beginning. This needs research. Of course, what we are doing here is we are undoing the concepts of race that colonialism and conquest inaugurated, and that enslavement inaugurated. And you know, we have different approaches. We need to resolve what this means for us in the forms of political solidarity that we create, in the way that we mobilize. A group of us did a special issue of the journal Public Culture 2 years ago about these questions. You know, I mean, what does the South African experience of non-racialism mean? It is not what in North America has created certain deliberate inattentiveness to questions of race in order to hold on power. You know, these are politics of knowledge. These are questions of politics, not questions of forgetting. And so it's these are the challenges that we have more broadly as we figure out how to attend to the legacies, the deep ongoing legacies of colonialism that we live with, that now are expressed in the borders of Europe, in who can travel where, who can't travel, who's allowed in, who's not allowed. I'm not allowed into certain countries because of the visas, and so I'm a scholar. I need to know stuff. I need to know stuff that's going on. Are there exhibitions that I can't go to? So these are we need to, as we attend to restitution, we need to attend to these other manifestations of colonialism that gather on Europe's borders, that gather on the borders of the United States, because the United States has its empire that it is also needing to deal with.
You know, it makes me think about, and this question it just popped. It was a thought that popped into my mind. I don't quite have a question yet, but listen to what Siraj is saying, and the image that Rashida provided from the Met, where I believe it's Elanatswi's piece there. So there's this tension we have, where we have the violence of the museums and the violence of the archive. But at the same time, we have a generation of artists that continue to valorize Western galleries and Western museums. And if they have exhibitions there, then they're on the world stage. And I think of I'm not calling out Elenatsu. I know he's based in Nsukka, and he trains African artists in Nigeria, although he's Ghanaian, he trains. But how can we reconcile this tension? Or is it, or am I imagining a tension that doesn't exist? This valorization on one end, but then a recognition of the violence on another end. You get what I'm saying? I know it's a half-baked thought, but maybe you could help me articulate what I'm thinking.
I feel like this is such a very deep and important question. And I think, you know, I worked for many years as a contemporary art curator. And, you know, I do see, one, I think it's also connected to this Dokolo conversation as well, you know, about collectors and curators and gatekeepers. And I think, you know, those roles are also very intensely centered and grounded in a certain historical trajectory, right? That is about the sort of protection of objects. And I think that, you know, for contemporary artists, they want to have the broadest audience for their work, right? I think there's something that is really, when you make something, you want people to see it. But I think there is a certain way, there is a certain freedom that you give up by participating, especially in these spaces, right, that are also valorizing other things, right? And we saw even the art world have its own moment. We saw Naomi Beckwith was just named as the chief curator at the Guggenheim, for example. And that came after a scandal, right, surrounding the Basquiat exhibition and the curator of that show being mistreated and Nancy Spector, you know, losing her seat. And so I think that there is a certain interrogation of, you know, the necessity of racial justice to have a place in the art world, which I think is actually similar to the way we're talking about museums, one of the last vestiges of spaces where we can participate, but have not succeeded in dismantling, you know, the huge kind of white supremacy that holds it up, right? And so I think we saw at the Whitney Museum 2 years ago how artists dropped out of the biennial because of, you know, the violence enacted by a board member who produced rubber bullets and all of these things that were used, you know, in Ferguson, at the pipeline, on the border. And so they use against, you know, all the people, all the marginalized communities whose works are simultaneously being shown at the first most diverse biennial in history. So I do feel like there is a process that's happening now that is also spurred by this global racial justice moment and movement, which is a continuum. I don't need to mention it as a moment, but I do think that it has become untenable in many ways for many artists and curators of color to participate in these kinds of spaces without critiquing them. And so Simone Lee, who is a good friend of mine and artist who I've, you know, worked with as a curator as well, is going to be the first Black artist in the Venice Biennial. And she spent so much time thinking about, well, what does it actually mean for me as a Black woman artist to represent the United States, especially in this, you know, I think pronounced ugly. I mean, the United States, obviously, as we spoke about, is an imperialist agenda, right, from its beginning. But I think, especially in the very pronounced moment that was this Trump era, you know, the kind of intense racial violence and trauma that has been enacted and reinvigorated during this time. What does it mean for her to be named as this artist to represent the United States, And so, you know, she's bringing students from Spelman into the conversation. She's already thinking about how to deconstruct in the same moment. And I think that that's the real job that many, I'll speak for Black artists, have to do in, you know, being a part of these exhibitions and being at the forefront of these huge kind of things that are set up, you know, on the backs of racial violence, colonialism. How are we dismantling in the same moment? And I think it's a complicated thing, and it's a burden, you know, that I don't see many white artists addressing in their practices. But we have to contend with that tension and that, you know, how do we participate in that violence or dismantle it?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I appreciate your redirection about the racial justice movement as a continuum and not a moment. We often speak of this racial justice in this moment of racial justice. We have about 15 minutes left. I do not want to neglect those who've taken time to pose some questions in the Q&A. I promised that I would pay attention to that. I haven't done as good a job as I promised to do, but I'm gonna try to fix that right now. We have a question and a point. See, I'm doing it again. All right. From Noor Amari. It says, first, thank you all the panelists. I was actually SIC 2015-2017 art history and am now a PhD at NYU at the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World. To what degree do you all think that there's the possibility of putting forth some overarching model of reframing non-Western objects in museums and also of their repatriation and what it means when they are returned? Is this type of paradigm even possible given the specifics? Do you want to take that one on?
I mean, Siraj probably can speak the most about this. I know there's all over the continent, which is a huge continent. There's a lot of conversation about how this is going to happen, whether or not too much emphasis is being placed on classical African art versus, ongoing cultural scenes happening now, etc.
One of the points that I think needs to be made is, one of the traps that we fall into, and that we had the benefit of learning in the 1970s from the thinking and the political ideas produced within Black consciousness about describing humans and phenomena in the negative. So in the 7 or 8 years or so that I've been working in Germany, in the time of the creation of this extremely controversial project, the Humboldt Forum, where Germany has tried to, it's in the project of making itself Western as a former communist, partly communist country. And in order to be Western, you need a large ethnographic monumental museum. This is what they've done, a 19th century museum. And they speak without any shame about this concept of non-Western, the non-West, the West and the non-West that continues to center the West, whereas the West is a fiction. Of course, it's politically real. You have these alliances and you have this, the West is always something that is being produced, So certainly, if we have an ongoing political production of something that we might call the South, or something that, along the lines of what has happened 4 or 5 decades before, then, that would be worthwhile, but we cannot think of ourselves into that category of the non-West. But taking the question seriously, we need to come up with models of undoing the categories of the museum system of Europe. So it's not just restitution, but undoing the classificatory order. So that in the United States, agreed that the Smithsonian has one of the world's foremost museums of African art. The museum, the new National Museum of African American History and Culture, will fail if it doesn't attend to the presence of the African exhibition and the African collection in the Museum of Natural History. Quite frankly, that is an unresolved problem. As much as I have a tremendous admiration for the colleagues and the curators who've done that work. In Europe, we've had ethnographic museums that have remodeled themselves as world museums, just a kind of rebranding. But to what extent has that heralded a new epistemology? to what extent do you demonstrate that the people of the earth are equal and each one worthy of respect? And the museum order that seeks a certain Westerness, and those near to the West, and those who are part of the story of the West. And that is why Orientalische Kunde, Oriental studies, and the Near East, the so-called Near East, and Egyptology are so important in this narrative. Our colleagues in Egypt, my archaeologist colleague, Monica Hanna, with whom I work, works on these questions of the reconnection of North Africa with the African continent. That is very important too. We have to work with a concept of Africa that is the Africa of the African Union.
So that's a helpful intervention there. But the implication is that then the onus is on the Museum of African American History and Culture to shift the paradigm, which seems to suggest that in the thinking and creation of this museum, they failed to rethink the possibilities of a museum. Is that the suggestion there?
Well, I mean, as that wonderful museum was being made, and one got to see it at different stages and to engage with colleagues there like John Franklin and so forth, and to we've had workshops and recently at the Museum of African Art, but these museums in the Smithsonian system tend to compete with each other. They don't collaborate sufficiently, in my view, and then here is an opportunity for them to ask questions about their display of African societies in the whole Smithsonian system. It is very important. This is an unresolved matter that cannot just be left in the organization of the colonized territories of the world into where the African whole is alongside the whole of evolution, and you get a certain kind of narrative, and the members of the public get a certain kind of narrative, as complex as that exhibition does present Africa. It is still something that I think it needs attention by the Smithsonian as a whole.
Rashida, I assume you spent a great deal of time there. We're running short on time, but I'm eager to get your thoughts on that issue.
Well, I was just thinking about how the construction of that museum really starts with enslavement. And, it's a very hard, I'm talking about the National Museum of the Smithsonian. But I did see, even prior to them opening, when, why am I blanking on the sister's name, who was from Spelman, who was the director of the Museum of African Art, her wanting to make some of these links, and there was an exhibition of African American art, which became very highly contested because it was from the Camille and Bill Cosby
That's right.
collection. So I think that she was trying to make that, those kind of, Janetta Cole, Dr. Janetta Cole was trying to bridge that gap, right, to show some of the objects in the African art collection with contemporary and modern African American artists, to show, not only just conceptual relationships, but also really to talk about that we can look at these things together in the same space. And so I think that's a really interesting proposal, Siraj, for them, especially because I know that they approach that museum with so many different lenses, the lens of architecture, the lens of contemporary art, cultural, kind of lens, like you see the mothership there from George Clinton. And so I think that there are ways that they could absolutely do that probably better than other aspects of the Smithsonian. But I also go back to your questions point, Benjamin, around whose responsibility is it? Because I think clearly the African American Museum would probably be the best one to do a good job there, but I also think that the Smithsonian itself has many questions to ask, and I think it will, right? Lonnie Birch is now at the head, so I think there is a great possibility that they will begin to have these important conversations and do this kind of reimagining that has been neglected for so long.
And it'll also be interesting to watch as Lonnie Birch transitions out and Kevin Young, who's on his way in to be. I'm sorry?
Naughty Bunch. Yeah.
Yeah, Kevin Young's on his way to be the director of the African American Museum of History and Culture. So we'll see what happens there. Short on time, but I wanted to touch on 2 points. I think this is a nice segue to David Ajayi's rendition for the Edo Museum of African Art in Nigeria, because he is the designer of the African American Museum of History and Culture in Washington, D.C. To move in that direction, I want to get Delinda, we talk about Europe, particularly France and Britain. We alluded to, even outside of the Smithsonian, the fact that the United States has skin in this colonial game. And in your own institution houses some Benin bronzes. And I don't want to just focus on Benin bronzes. And I mentioned the Ethiopian manuscripts to kind of silence the other pieces of art that are in private galleries and private collections and museums outside of this. I think the Benin bronzes kind of hold a lot of space in the conversation. That being said, I'm going to return to the Benin bronzes. In your own institution, they have a history there of a debate around what to do with those. If you could just speak on that. And then I want to get some final thoughts on moving forward, where we want to push this conversation and what the promise and possibility holds from this new museum being planned in Nigeria. Delinda?
Yeah. It's complicated. There's we have a few, like a handful of pieces from Benin. The Field Museum has the lion's share. They have an enormous amount of ivories in particular. So I think that's the big story there. But what's interesting is digging through those records of how they were acquired, and they were acquired not through theft but through sale. And there's a long so the Kingdom of Benin asked for them back in 2008, I think it was, 2 or 8. I'm not, anyway. And the legality of that request was debated because some people say it's the Federation of Nigeria that needs to do that petitioning. So there was a lot of discussion of the legality of the request, of whether the museum would return it. But around that same time, James Cuno, who was the head of the museum, kind of joined with the Met and made this declaration of the universality of the museum, which has long been used as kind of the argument to not return things. And of course, as we've been noting time and time again, the universality is linked to whiteness. It's linked to Europeanness, Americanness, or the European Americanness, right? And so that doesn't hold water, in my opinion. But what the complication is when museums or collections acquire these through sale, then we have to return to that original question of whether or not this was a just war and they were considered to be spoils. So if you look at the acquisition record for one of the Benin bronzes in the museum, it names it a spoil of war, and doesn't have any commentary about that war and the justness or the legality of it, other than to kind of suggest that it was a just war on behalf of the British, right? But it names it a spoil of war, and as such, I don't know if the author was doing this on purpose, but would have marked that as a legally justifiable purchase because it had this history. So it's complicated. Nothing came of that request, and I would have to do more digging to see whatever became of that. But just as we see time and time again, these things get hung up in court, or are just ignored.
this debate has moved on quite substantially in the last few months. The Benin Dialogue Forum itself, with our colleagues, Barbara Punkensteiner, long-time Benin art scholar, and all the institutions that hold these collections, and the model of loans and of a monumental museum that is being planned and of storage, and to attend to the argument that Africans can't look after these things and so forth. I mean, that whole debate has been shot in the water with the publication of the Brutish Museums by Dan Hicks that presents a forensic account of how these objects were acquired under the circumstances of extreme violence, labeled a punitive expedition, but which was not just a punitive, it was planned, and where every object has a history, and the book traces where every object is today and what collect. Now, of course, museums are going to say, we bought this on an auction. We bought this legally, but they originate in that act of violence. And so, quite frankly, the agenda for the Benin Dialogue Forum has to become something else. This is going to be, right now, one of the world's most important restitutions that is going to take place. And it's going to take place from all the museums in question, because that is the direction that this is moving in. Right now, Berlin is silent. There are official claims being put in by the Nigerian state through the ambassador. But there is silence on these questions, and that silence, is becoming so loud that, the world is changing all around us. The field has changed. It is no longer tenable to hold onto artifacts whose provenance is immoral, whose provenance begins in an act of violence and conquest. So that is not, if the European people want to imagine themselves on that particular history, quite frankly, we need to be rethinking who we are and rethinking our relationship with this object. It needs to be the world's project to make certain that these objects are returned. This is in the interests of the museums of the world. It's for all of us. It's for everyone. It is for humanity.
It is an issue of humanity, and silence is a form of violence, isn't it? We are close to time. Every object has a history. There's so much to take away from your point, Siraj. Rashida, I'm going to leave the last word to you before we close out.
No pressure to follow. And I think I will just take that moment to re-emphasize what Siraj said. This is a conversation for humanity. This is a conversation for all of us to investigate the violences that we participate in, by investing in the institutions that continue to commit this violence, by not addressing the moral ground on which restitution stands, which is that these don't belong here. They never should have been here. And how do we actually go about confronting that? And so I think this will actually be something that allows us to halt the kind of authoritarianism that we are seeing come back around in the world. How do we have a conversation about fascism if we can't have a conversation about colonialism? How do we have a conversation about the immorality of a Trump, right? The immorality of a Putin? We actually can't talk about what are as these nations who ship democracy out to the rest of the world, if we can't have our own conversation about what is the moral underpinning that all of this stands on, then, you know, I think that we have a very vacant argument to, you know, to kind of confront authoritarianism and fascism. And so I'm honored to be in conversation with all of you, to be a part of this movement, which will benefit the future generations. So thank you.
Yeah, and the conversation continues. I want to, on behalf of Michael Gomez and Seaside, thank you all who dialed into this conversation. Thank you, Delinda Collier from the Art Institute of Chicago, Rashida Bumbray of the Open Societies Foundation, and Siraj Rasool of the University of Western Cape in South Africa. Thank you so much for this very, very rich conversation. I'm grateful. I'm Benjamin Talton from Temple University. See you in the next conversation, and follow Seaside for the next event. Thank you all again.
Thank you.